16. The next morning he went straight to Grimal. First he paid for his goat leather, paid in full without a grumble or the least bit of haggling. And then he invited Grimal to the Tour d'Argent for a bottle of white wine and negotiations concerning the purchase of Grenouille, his apprentice. It goes without saying that he did not reveal to him the whys and wherefores of this purchase. He told some story about how he had a large order for scented leather, and to fill it he needed unskilled help. He required a lad of few needs who would do simple tasks, cutting leather and so forth. He ordered another bottle of wine and offered 20 livres as recompense for the inconvenience the loss of Grenouille would cause Grimal. 20 livres was an enormous sum. Grimal immediately took him up on it. They walked to the tannery where, strangely enough, Grenouille was waiting with his bundle already packed. Baldini paid the 20 livres and took him along at once, well aware that he had just made the best deal of his life. Grimal, who for his part was convinced that he had just made the best deal of his life, returned to the Tour d'Argent. There drank 2 more bottles of wine, moved over to the Lion d'Or on the other bank around noon, and got so rip-roaring drunk there that when he decided to go back to the Tour d'Argent late that night, he got the Rue Geoffroy Lanier confused with the Rue des Nonandières, and instead of coming out directly onto the pont, Marie as he had intended, he was brought by ill fortune to the Quai des Ormes, where he splashed lengthwise and face first into the water like a soft mattress. He was dead in an instant. The river, however, needed considerable time to drag him out from the shallows, past the barges moored there into the stronger main current, and not until the early morning hours did Grimal the tanner, or better, his soaked carcass, float briskly downriver toward the west. As he passed the Pont au Change soundlessly without bumping against the bridge piers, 60 feet directly overhead Jean, Baptiste Grenouille was going to bed. A bunk had been set up for him in a back corner of Baldini's laboratory, and he was now about to take possession of it, while his former employer floated down the cold Seine, all 4 limbs extended. Grenouille rolled himself up into a little ball like a tick. As he fell off to sleep, he sank deeper and deeper into himself, leading the triumphant entry into his innermost fortress, where he dreamed of an odoriferous victory banquet, a gigantic orgy with clouds of incense and fogs of myrrh, held in his own honor. With the acquisition of Grenouille, the house of Giuseppe Baldini began its ascent to national, indeed European, renown. The Persian chimes never stopped ringing. The herons never stopped spewing in the shop on the Pont au Change. The very first evening, Grenouille had to prepare a large demijohn full of Nuit Napolitaine, of which over 80 flacons were sold in the course of the next day. The fame of the scent spread like wildfire. Chenier's eyes grew glassy from the moneys paid, and his back ached from all the deep bows he had to make, for only persons of high, indeed highest rank, or at least the servants of persons of high and highest rank, appeared. One day the door was flung back so hard it rattled. In stepped the footman of Count d'Argenson and shouted, as only footmen can shout, that he wanted 5 bottles of this new scent. Chenier was still shaking with awe 15 minutes later, for Count d'Argenson was commissary and war minister to His Majesty, and the most powerful man in Paris. While Chenier was subjected to the onslaught of customers in the shop, Baldini had shut himself up in his laboratory with his new apprentice. He justified this state of affairs to Chenier with a fantastic theory that he called division of labor and increased productivity. For years, he explained, he had patiently watched while Pélissier and his ilk despisers of the ancient craft all had enticed his customers away and made a shambles of his business. His forbearance was now at an end. He was accepting their challenge and striking back at these cheeky parvenus, and what was more, with their own weapons. Every season, every month, if necessary, every week, he would play trumps, a new perfume, and what perfumes they would be. He would draw fully upon his creative talents, and for that it was necessary that he, assisted only by an unskilled helper, would be solely and exclusively responsible for the production of scents, while Chenier would devote himself exclusively to their sale. By using such modern methods, they would open a new chapter in the history of perfumery, sweeping aside their competitors and growing incomparably rich. Yes, he had consciously and explicitly said they, because he intended to allow his old and trusted journeyman to share a given percentage of these incomparable riches. Only a few days before, Chenier would have regarded such talk as a sign of his master's incipient senility. Ready for the charité, he would have thought. It won't be long now before he lays down the pestle for good. But now he was not thinking at all. He didn't get around to it. He simply had too much to do. He had so much to do that come evening he was so exhausted he could hardly empty out the cash box and siphon off his cut. Not in his wildest dreams would he have doubted that things were not on the up and up, though Baldini emerged from his laboratory almost daily with some new scent. And what scents they were! Not just perfumes of high, indeed highest quality, but also creams and powders, soaps, hair tonics, toilet waters, oils. Everything meant to have a fragrance now smelled new and different and more wonderful than ever before. And as if bewitched, the public pounced upon everything, absolutely everything. Even the newfangled scented hair ribbons that Baldini created one day on a curious whim. And price was no object. Everything that Baldini produced was a success. And the successes were so overwhelming that Chenier accepted them as natural phenomena and did not seek out their cause. That perhaps the new apprentice, that awkward gnome, who was housed like a dog in the laboratory, and whom one saw sometimes when the master stepped out, standing in the background wiping off glasses and cleaning mortars, that this cipher of a man might be implicated in the fabulous blossoming of their business, Chenier would not have believed had he been told it. Naturally, the gnome had everything to do with it. Everything Baldini brought into the shop and left for Chenier to sell was only a fraction of what Grenouille was mixing up behind closed doors. Baldini couldn't smell fast enough to keep up with him. At times he was truly tormented by having to choose among the glories that Grenouille produced. This sorcerer's apprentice could have provided recipes for all the perfumers of France without once repeating himself, without once producing something of inferior or even average quality. As a matter of fact, he could not have provided them with recipes, i.e., formulas, for at first Grenouille still composed his scents in the totally chaotic and unprofessional manner familiar to Baldini, mixing his ingredients impromptu and in apparent wild confusion. Unable to control the crazy business, but hoping at least to get some notion of it, Baldini demanded one day that Grenouille use scales, measuring glasses, and the pipette when preparing his mixtures, even though he considered them unnecessary. Further, he was to get used to regarding the alcohol not as another fragrance, but as a solvent to be added at the end. And for God's sake, he would simply have to go about things more slowly, at an easier and slower pace, as befitted a craftsman. Grenouille did it. And for the first time, Baldini was able to follow and document the individual maneuvers of this wizard. Paper and pen in hand, constantly urging a slower pace, he sat next to Grenouille and jotted down how many drams of this, how many level measures of that, how many drops of some other ingredient wandered into the mixing bottles. This was a curious after-the-fact method for analyzing a procedure. It employed principles whose very absence ought to have totally precluded the procedure to begin with. But by employing this method, Baldini finally managed to obtain such synthetic formulas. How it was that Grenouille could mix his perfumes without the formulas was still a puzzle, or better, a miracle to Baldini. But at least he had captured this miracle in a formula, satisfying in part his thirst for rules and order, and preventing the total collapse of his perfumer's universe. In due time, he ferreted out the recipes for all the perfumes Grenouille had thus far invented, and finally he forbade him to create new scents unless he, Baldini, was present with pen and paper to observe the process with Argus eyes, and to document it step by step. In his fastidious, prickly hand he copied his notes, soon consisting of dozens of formulas, into 2 different little books. One he locked in his fireproof safe, and the other he always carried with him, even sleeping with it at night. That reassured him, For now, should he wish, he could himself perform Grenouille's miracles, which had on first encounter so profoundly shaken him. He believed that by collecting these written formulas, he could exorcise the terrible creative chaos erupting from his apprentice. Also the fact that he no longer merely stood there staring stupidly, but was able to participate in the creative process by observing and recording it, had a soothing effect on Baldini and strengthened his self-confidence. After a while, he even came to believe that he made a not insignificant contribution to the success of these sublime scents. And when he had once entered them in his little books and entrusted them to his safe and his bosom, he no longer doubted that they were now his and his alone. But Grenouille, too, profited from the disciplined procedures Baldini had forced upon him. He was not dependent on them himself. He never had to look up an old formula to reconstruct a perfume weeks or months later, for he never forgot an odor. But by using the obligatory measuring glasses and scales, he learned the language of perfumery, and he sensed instinctively that the knowledge of this language could be of service to him. After a few weeks, Grenouille had mastered not only the names of all the odors in Baldini's laboratory, but he was also able to record the formulas for his perfumes on his own, and vice versa, to convert other people's formulas and instructions into perfumes and other scented products. And not merely that. Once he had learned to express his fragrant ideas in drops and drams, he no longer even needed the intermediate step of experimentation. When Baldini assigned him a new scent, whether for a handkerchief, cologne, a sachet, or a face paint, Grenouille no longer reached for flakons and powders, but instead simply sat himself down at the table and wrote the formula straight out. He had learned to extend the journey from his mental notion of a scent to the finished perfume by way of writing down the formula. For him it was a detour. In the world's eyes, that is, in Baldini's, it was progress. Grenouille's miracles remained the same, but the recipes he now supplied along with Thierry removed the terror, and that was for the best. The more Grenouille mastered the tricks and tools of the trade, the better he was able to express himself in the conventional language of perfumery, and the less his master feared and suspected him. While still regarding him as a person with exceptional olfactory gifts, Baldini no longer considered him a second Frangipani, or worse, some weird wizard. And that was fine with Grenouille. The regulations of the craft functioned as a welcome disguise. He virtually lulled Baldini to sleep with his exemplary procedures, weighing ingredients, swirling the mixing bottles, sprinkling the test handkerchief. He could shake it out almost as delicately, pass it beneath his nose almost as elegantly as his master. And from time to time, at spaced intervals, he would make mistakes that could not fail to capture Baldini's notice, forgetting to filter, setting the scales wrong, fixing the percentage of ambergris tincture in the formula ridiculously high, and took his scoldings for the mistakes, correcting them then most conscientiously. Thus he managed to lull Baldini into the illusion that ultimately this was all perfectly normal. He was not out to cheat the old man after all. He truly wanted to learn from him. Not how to mix perfumes, not how to compose a scent correctly, not that of course. In that sphere there was no one in the world who could have taught him anything, nor would the ingredients available in Baldini's shop have even begun to suffice for his notions about how to realize a truly great perfume. The scents he could create at Baldini's were playthings compared with those he carried within him and that he intended to create one day. But for that, he knew, two indispensable prerequisites must be met. The first was the cloak of middle-class respectability, the status of a journeyman at the least, under the protection of which he could indulge his true passions and follow his true goals unimpeded. The second was the knowledge of the craft itself, the way in which scents were produced, isolated, concentrated, preserved, and thus first made available for higher ends. For Grenouille did indeed possess the best nose in the world, both analytical and visionary, but he did not yet have the ability to make those scents realities.